Hey everyone, we're back at the Bellagio for some Saturday night fun. If you go ahead and click like and subscribe, I have a feeling this will turn out to be a good session. Just a few minutes in, we get into an interesting one. Under the gun opens to 10, and we're next to act with pocket 7s. Looking around the table, I'm not seeing many familiar faces, which is usually a good sign. I toss in the call, an older gentleman on my left calls, and 3 others call behind, so we're a million ways to the flop. It comes down 9, 8, 7 rainbow, giving us bottom set on a connected board. Under the gun checks, and with the whole world left to act behind me, I think I'm checking range here. The gentleman on my left bets 25, and it folds back around to under the gun, who calls. I'm not too worried about under the gun and think he has an overpair at best, but the other player should have a pretty strong range of 2 pair plus, maybe some pair plus draw type hands. I call to see what develops on the turn. It's a blank 2 of hearts. We both check to our distinguished friend, who continues for 45. Under the gun calls, and I'm wondering if I should check raise or just call. The bet is on the smaller side, but he's firing again after getting called by 2 people, so I'm getting mixed messages. I think a straight or better set would want to size up now, so I was leaning towards him having more of a drawing or medium strength hand. I'm still not worried about under the gun, so decide to call and keep them both in there. The river helps out a little bit. It's another deuce, giving us a boat. Under the gun checks, and I consider leading, but I think it's just so obvious my hand is strong when I do that. I check again to keep setting the trap. He takes the bait and bets 200, leaving about 150 behind. Under the gun folds, and I move all in, and he snap folds. So he must have been getting after it with something like ace-10. We look down at some beautiful ladies, pocket queens, and open it up to 15. The cutoff raises to 45, and the station cold calls in the big blind. We bump it back up to 200. The cutoff folds, and surprise, surprise, the station calls again. The pot is about 450, and he has around 550 behind. The flop comes down 7, 7, 6 with 2 clubs, and before I can even barely register the board, he snap shoves. There's not much to consider here, so I flick in a chip for the call. The board runs out an offsuit 8 and a jack. He says, "You're good," and I flip over the queens. Early position opens to 15, and we pick up pocket kings on the button and raise to 50. It folds back to him, and he calls. They don't call kings ace magnets for nothing, so of course the flop is ace, queen, 4, rainbow. Still, this board is much better for our range, so I think we're betting pretty often here. Kings can still get a bit of value from a queen, smaller pocket pairs, and some gut shots, so I put out a small bet of 35. He calls. The turn is no bueno, it's another queen. He checks and I check it back. The river is a blank 6, and now he leads for 60. Pretty annoying spot since he can have a lot of queens and aces for this size. I'm looking at him and my gut feels like he's weak, but I'm having a hard time finding the bluffs. Our kings block a few of those gutters, so I even say out loud he would have to be turning something like a pocket pair into a bluff. I just couldn't find enough bluffs to balance out all the value in his range, so I go against my gut and fold. He cracks a big smile and says, "For the good of the game, I'll show it," and flips over the dirty diaper, 3 deuce suited. Yeah, this is what Saturday night poker is all about. You love to see it. Was this a bad fold? Let's head into GTO Wizard to find out. Pre-flop is all standard from our side. On the ace queen 4 flop, out of position is never leading. We're betting over 75% of the time, and most often for a small size. You can see kings are one of the hands we check back the most, but still bets about half the time. Facing the small bet, early position is actually raising pretty often. I don't see this sort of board check raised in a 3-bet pot very much, but we're supposed to check raise 2 pair plus with gut shots and some low pairs for balance. In practice, I think people, including myself, find the value check raises but are not bluffing enough here. His calling range is mainly top pair type hands. On the turn, queen out of position is never leading. We check back a little over half the time, and kings is pretty much a pure check, except for the king of hearts, king of clubs combo. It looks like that one blocks the 2 remaining king-queen suited, so GTO is turning it into a bluff. What a sicko. On the river 6, after we check back the turn, out of position is betting about 70% of the time. Facing a 3rd pot bet, kings are a mix between folding, calling, and jamming. Just do whatever you want. Looking at the EV, you can see none of the options are really good for us, which is why it was such an annoying spot. Hands like 9s and 8s actually work better as a call since they aren't blocking any of his missed gut shots. Was a fun hand, and glad to see I didn't torch a bunch of EV by making a bad fold. We open pocket jacks on the button and the small blind raises to 65. He's been on the active side today with a bunch of 3-bet folds, so I decided to just call and keep that wide range in. The flop is 7-7-3 rainbow, pretty good looking board for jacks. Outside of a few suited 7s, neither of us will have trips very often. He still has the queens, kings, and aces, but I'm ahead of his 8s, 9s, and 10s, as well as his overcard and ace-high hands, which make up the majority of his range. So when he bets 50, I think we have enough equity to put in a small raise, and I bump it up to 125. He calls. I think he'd be raising with the top end of his range, so feeling pretty good about my jacks. We're looking for any non-ace or king turn, and it rolls off the 10 of hearts, putting a flush draw out there. He checks, and I think this is the turn we're happy to get it in on. He'll have improved to a pair with some hands like ace 10 suited, king 10 suited, queen 10 suited, or could have picked up a flush draw. He's about 350 behind. Jamming might make him fold out flush draws, so I bet 175. It doesn't take him too long to go all in. I don't see folding being an option here, so we put in the call and get shown pocket 10s. Sometimes they just hit the 2 outer, and we don't return the favor on the river ace. Let's take a look at this one in the lab. We open a wide range on the button, and the small blind is typically 3-betting. We mainly call on the button, and jacks mix between jamming, raising small, and calling. At this stack depth, the EV happens to be exactly the same for all 3 options. On the 7-7-3 flop, the small blind is betting a bit over half the time, favoring a half pot to 3/4 pot size. We are mainly calling on the button, but do find some raises with 8s, 9s, 10s, and jacks, with a few ace-x hands as bluffs. For jacks, GTO prefers to raise with the jack of hearts in hand. I'm not sure why GTO picks that combo, and unfortunately it doesn't come with explanations. Either way, the EV is pretty much the same between calling and raising these overpairs. Facing a raise, the small blind is supposed to jam 30% of the time. On the turn 10, the small blind is always checking. We bet about 2/3 of the time, using 1/3 pot the majority of the time. It looks like having the jack of spades blocks a few of his draws, but we're still betting jacks most of the time. When he jams, we're calling it off with any pair, slam dunking it in there with jacks. Unfortunate turn card, but from a GTO perspective, I think we play this one fine. We open 10-7 of diamonds on the button and get called by the big blind who just sat down with 200. The flop is king 10-8 rainbow. He checks, and we check behind with our middle pair. The turn 6 gives us a gut shot, so when he checks again, I bet 15. He clicks it back to 30, basically announcing he has a king. We have decent enough implied odds if we hit the river, so we come along. The river, 10, definitely helps. And now the big blind checks. I'm wondering how much a king would call. Probably a lot, so I bet 100. He jams for 60 more, and it smells like I took myself to Value Town, but folding isn't a consideration. I flick it in and he turns over, ace king. We open king jack of diamonds under the gun and get an early position caller. The big blind, a fun player, also calls. The flop is 9-6-4 2 diamonds. The big blind checks, and I think we can either check or bet small. I decide to bet 20. Early position folds and the big blind calls. The turn is an offsuit 5. The big blind checks, and again I think we can either check or bet. It's not a great board for our range, but betting gives us a chance to steal the pot now or build it in case we hit the river. I bet 50 and he calls. The river is 8 of diamonds, giving us the flush and putting a one-liner on the board. He checks and only has about 250 behind. I've seen him make some pretty light call downs today, and there are a lot of strong hands he could have. Flushes, straights, and 2 pairs. I put him all in and he folds. Later he told me it was 2 pair, which had me wondering if I should have gone smaller on the river. Let's see what GTOWizard says. For this one, we'll just focus on early position versus the big blind. King jack suited is a normal open, and the big blind is defending with about 40% of hands. On the 9-6-4 flop, the big blind is never leading. We bet over 55% of the time, using 1/3 to 3/4 pot. It looks like GTO is using basically the same range, but just splitting it into 3 bet sizes. So I would simplify this and just bet 50% with the whole betting range. The king jack of diamonds is betting 85% of the time. The big blind is mainly calling, but also raises with top pair and better, balanced with some combo draws and middle pair bluffs. The turn 5 is much better for the big blind range, so it's leading nearly 80% of the time for 20% pot. We're checking back over 60% of the time, but King Jack of Diamonds prefers to keep betting. It looks like GTO bets more often with the King and Ace High flush draws and finds some checkbacks with the lower ones. Facing another bet, the big blind is mostly calling. On the river, the big blind is leading a little over 20% of the time with hands like flushes, straights, and two pair, but keeping some combos in his checking range. We don't have too many overbets, but GTO does prefer an overbet here with flushes. The big blind just has so many straights and two pairs it's supposed to call with, so GTO is going for max value. While this overbet is good in theory, I think I have to be a little more careful about who I choose to overbet for value. Regs know they're supposed to pay it off, but fun players are overfolding here. A super nitty reg opens to 20 from early position, and we pick up Ace King off on the button. When I say nitty reg, I mean he plays one hand an hour. I mean I've never seen him show down worse than Jacks or Ace King. Never. So I'm not exaggerating when I say that 3-betting Ace King versus his early open already didn't feel good, but I still gotta do it, you know. I raised to 60 and the big blind cold calls with about 200 behind. The nitty reg puts in the 4-bet to 200. We're both pretty deep and he covers me. Everyone at the table knows the big blind is calling, so this raise is just never a bluff. I know his normal range is already so freaking tight, and now we removed even the possibility of a bluff. It still pains me to even think about folding, but we're in such bad shape against Jacks plus and Ace King. It just felt like I was getting free rolled where the worst he ever has is chopping, and the rest of the time he's dominating our head. I ended up folding, and the big blind of course calls. The flop comes down Ace Queen 9 and the big blind flips over his Jacks, but he's drawing thin against the reg's Queens. No miracle 2-outer on the turn or river, and the reg gets paid off for his one hand an hour. Call me a nit if you want, call me resorts oriented, but it was great not to ship my stack over to him. There are 5 limpers when I look down at pocket jiggities in the small blind. I raised to 35, but maybe this should have been more like 40 to 50. When you're dealing with a limp happy table, the goal is to bet the maximum so that only one person will call. In this one we get called by an early position fun limper, and the cutoff who is the nitty reg. The flop is King 9-3 with 2 clubs. Not great to see an overcard, but how many kings are these guys really limping? I put them on more weak pair, low suited connector type cards. I bet 30 and just the fun player calls. The turn is a blank 5. I still think he has a lot of 9x, small pairs, or flush draw type hands, so I put out a thin value bet of 40. He calls. The river is a 7, which doesn't change much. I think going for 3 streets is a little too thin, so I check it over to him. He checks it back pretty quickly. I turn over my Jacks and find out I took myself on a small detour to Value Town when he flips over King Queen off. The hijack limps and we pick up 5-4 of clubs in the cutoff and raise to 20. The big blind calls and the hijack calls. The flop is 3-2-2 with 2 clubs, giving us the open-ended straight flush draw. They both check to me. Lots of turns that improve us, so I want to start building the pot and bet 20. They both call. The turn does not help. It's another 2. It checks to me and I check it back. The river does help. It's the 6 of clubs giving us a straight flush. Would love to see someone bet, but it checks to me. They either have air or are slow playing a monster, so I bet pot hoping to put the bad beat on someone, but they both fold. We trade some small pots back and forth before calling it a night and racking up.